You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello and welcome to Modern Musicology. My name is Alan. I have my co-host here, Stephanie Seymour.
Howdy, everybody.
And Rob Levy.
Hey, hello.
And we have the enormous pleasure of being joined by a special guest today. This is Mr. Richard Evans, who is the author of Listening to the Music the Machines Make, Inventing Electronic Pop 1978 to 1983. Mr. Evans, thank you so much for joining us. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's been brilliant to be invited.
The book came out in November in the UK, and we are recording this show on January 29th. The book just came out here in the US 3 days ago, January 26th. We've all had the opportunity to read it, and like I was telling you earlier, I have thoroughly enjoyed this book.
Yeah.
So we're very excited to talk to you about it.
Well, thank you very, very much for the compliment. And I'm delighted to talk about any of this.
I'm wondering if you can talk about how the book came about, because there's a lot, and the germination of the book is probably just as fascinating as the book itself.
Well, let's hope so, eh? The idea of the book sort of came from several different directions over quite a long period of time. I'm a great reader of books about music. I'm a big fan, and it's like I'm quite indiscriminate in what I read. And so they're not all electronic music biographies or about the electronic music genre particularly. But that's kind of where my personal interests sort of lay. Although, you know, my musical church is quite broad. And because I read all these biographies, I started to realize that when people sit down and write about their life, so I'm talking about autobiographies here, really, they're looking back at these times from 35, 40 years. And it started to occur to me that not through any fault of anybody's own, but it felt that inconsistencies were starting to creep into some of these stories. So I think, you know, it's like people remember things differently because it's been such a long time. And also because the things that they've achieved have been so lauded and so sort of popularized that there's almost like a myth built up around these events. And I thought it would be interesting to go back to the original time. So it's like it was almost like a time travel book in a funny sort of a way. And I thought it would be really interesting to go back and look at the original music press that was happening at the same time as these events. And as I sort of thought through this, I realized also that no one had actually done this with electronic music. There are sort of books about other genres of music that have kind of taken the same sort of approach, but there wasn't one for this. And it felt like an opportunity, and it felt like something that I'd be really interested in doing and taking on. And then I basically did nothing with the idea for probably about 3 years. But in my head, I was writing a book about electronic music. And at that point, I went to the British Library in London, which is an absolutely fantastic resource for for anyone. But if you're interested in music in particular, because you can literally walk into their reading room, and you can go up to this shelf and you can pull off these huge bound volumes, and they're probably this thick, you know, maybe sort of 4 or 5 inches thick, and they contain all the, for example, NMEs, you know, for 1978.
Right.
And you can choose your year, and you can just take these huge books and put them on a desk. And I just went through them. And it's like I did the NME and the Melody Maker and Sounds and Smash Hits and every popular music title I could think of and every popular culture title I could think of, I looked at for the book. And every time I found a reference to something I thought might be might be of use. One of the bands that made it into the book, I took a photo of that reference on my phone, and I ended up with literally thousands of photographs on my phone, and it was almost like these photographs were jigsaw pieces, and then from those jigsaw pieces, I could build the book that it became.
It's incredible the amount of information packed into this book. I could not even believe the amount of quotes and data. Really, just the chart information. It was incredible.
And I feel like there's no wasted words. Like there's nothing superfluous. Everything is so to the point. It's such a well-crafted book, I think.
Well, that's brilliant here. I think if I'd have known what a mammoth task it would have been at the beginning, then maybe we wouldn't be talking now.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been daunting to look at your pictures and then how do I compile this?
And I loved how you made a reference point linking punk to electronic music. I just thought that was really great. You just sort of laid that out in a really cohesive and wonderful way.
Yeah, like saying that it was the two tenets of punk, like the DIY spirit and the belief that you said education, knowledge, and virtuosity was no longer a prerequisite for making music. Like that is so perfect for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it must have been so much fun to be a musician in those times, those immediate post-punk years, because all of a sudden people had access to electronic instruments. The first affordable synthesizers started to become available. It was one of those choices. You could spend your money on a guitar, or you could spend your money on a primitive synthesizer. And people started doing the latter. And they'd come out of punk, and they were sort of inspired by punk, I think, but not so much musically. I think musically, punk was a little bit old-fashioned, in lots of ways. It was, the same instruments, it was the same sort of structures. It was just faster and probably a bit angrier. And then, it's like people not only bought into this DIY attitude that punk gave them, that they could do these things themselves. They could release their own music. They could make their own music. They could set up their own studios, in a bedroom or a cellar or wherever it was that they could find some space. And they could take their careers into their own hands. But I don't think they really expected them to be careers as such. It was like there was this sort of amateur dabbling, which was probably the root of some of the most interesting and exciting of those early records.
And it's funny how it sort of all came full circle in a way to now, where people do the same thing. But but the difference is, at that time, nobody had the internet, and you could not get your music out. You needed record companies.
Absolutely, yeah. And all of a sudden, you didn't need record companies. And also, I think that these people, like you say, there was no internet, so there was no one making those connections between the bands. So they were almost operating in little voids.
Grassroots, yeah.
Which is really interesting, because it's like, although Sheffield had several bands working in this area, they weren't aware necessarily of what was happening in Liverpool with Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, or London, which is where the Normal were.
Manchester, like Duran Duran and stuff.
Or Manchester, yeah, exactly. And it was only gradually that these people started to realize that there was other people working in this sphere, and they weren't alone. And I think sometimes they were a little bit indignant that was the case, because they wanted to be the only ones doing this. And also it was probably quite a relief, a validation, I suppose, that they were onto something that was of interest to other people as well.
The point that you're making about the affordability of synthesizers is something I want to come back to in a minute, but I want to go right back to the very beginning of the book. When I first started reading it, I was kind of surprised that your beginning point was that famous David Bowie Top of the Pop performance of Starman. And it kind of made me wonder, the significance of that moment is something that's been talked about a lot, but not necessarily specifically with electronic music. But also, I'm curious to know, when you're putting a book like this together, how do you decide what your starting point is? And how did you pick that point as, this is where my story begins and where I'm going to run from?
It's interesting, actually, because I wasn't quite sure where to start the book.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and I wasn't really that sure where to finish the book either, which is why it's so big. I knew that there had to be a section at the beginning which kind of qualified what was about to happen. So it's broadly, I've called it inspiration. The section is called inspiration, and it's kind of everything that came before 1978, which I felt was an important enough influence on the people who I write about to be worth mentioning. And the one name that comes up again and again and again in electronic music, and probably in all forms of music, is David Bowie. Who was an absolutely remarkable artist, as I don't need to tell you. But because because there was this moment, this sort of fabled moment in 1972 when he was on Top of the Pops in the UK, and he performed Starman, and so many different artists have picked up on that moment as a moment of it kind of enabled them. It made them feel that they were part of something cosmic, perhaps, something special, something technological and beyond. And I think that was enough to get people interested in music before perhaps they were interested in making electronic music. So that seemed like a great place to start, because like you say, it was an iconic moment. People would recognize it. And I liked the fact that my book about electronic music starts with an acoustic guitar. I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, it's very poetic.
And then when it came to sort of starting the book proper, and it starts in 1978 and goes to 1983, it was either going to be 1977 or 1978. And I couldn't quite decide for a while whether to include I Feel Love, Donna Summer's record, as the beginning of a new thing or the end of an old thing. And because it was
so interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Alan, you talked about that in another podcast about that song.
Yeah. The album that song comes from, it's structured where every song kind of represents a different decade. And then the last track propels you into the future. And as Brian Eno said, when he rushed into the studio with David Bowie and said, I have just discovered the future of music. It's an incredibly clever structuring of an album, and that last track sets everything that's going to come down the road electronically.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's an absolutely brilliant track, and even today you can put it on and it doesn't date. It still sounds powerful and exciting. And we were talking about the importance of punk, and for me, it's kind of a punk record in a funny sort of a way. It has that sort of attitude to it, that sort of the minimalness and the sort of the way it kind of grabs you. Yeah. I was aware of that sort of that structure of the album, and that was kind of where I wasn't quite sure whether to sort of finish the first bit or start the second bit with that record. And in the end, I decided that disco was kind of part of the influences, so it should stay on the disco side rather than the innovators and the new generation side.
I remember when that song came out, I was kind of young at the time, and I was fully aware that it didn't sound like anything else that I'd ever heard. I wasn't really sure why. I didn't quite understand. Like I didn't hear anything that sounded like a drum or a bass or whatever, but I didn't understand why it was as different as it was. It was later on that, of course, I realized, and understood. But
definitely something, Alan, that I was thinking about as I read this book, because I remember, when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, I mean, like it didn't matter. It was just like this new sound. You knew there was a new sound. You couldn't really put your finger on it or articulate it. I mean, everyone knew, okay, synthesizers, but it just, the whole genesis of the scene, it wasn't apparent to me as a young teenager, the history of it. But, obviously looking back, it's comprehensive and definitely has a spark, like you said.
And I remember, I wasn't even 10, but my brother came home and had it and played it over and over. It's probably one of the 2 or 3 first records I remember hearing my brother play over and over and over, like relentlessly. And I've got his copy of it now. The whole 12-inch thing with like super long, and it's a beast. I mean, you're totally right about saying that it's punk rock, because it's kind of got this sophisticated veneer, but underneath it, there's a really rawness to it, right? And I think that rawness sort of transfers later into some of the electronic stuff too. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about too is you mentioned Kraftwerk, right, and Neu as starting points, and you also have this movement in Germany with electronic music at the same time, and a lot of the folks in England are like, "Oh my God, this is amazing! This is all happening at the same time." And I think I Feel Love is kind of where that all comes together, right? And it's
it was recorded in Germany, right? I mean, I think most of the Moroder stuff, and certainly with Donna, I think a lot of that stuff was done in German studios. So they're there soaking in that influence.
Yeah, I believe it was recorded in Munich, in Giorgio Moroder's studios in Munich.
Yes.
I wouldn't swear to that.
No, I believe that's right. Yeah.
And just jumping ahead a little bit to, I think it was a quote that Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran says about how much Giorgio Moroder was a key influence on them. And not just from that song, but I think other productions and stuff. But
yeah, I think it was really important that this particular generation, they were less wed to certain genres. And they were much happier to bring in these different influences in a way that would have been considered wrong in the punk days. But they were pulling in stuff from the prog rock bands. They were pulling in stuff from disco. They were pulling in stuff, the electronic stuff from Germany that you were just talking about. It's like, and all of these genres have sort of key records that that sparked imagination, sparked inspiration. And they sort of unashamedly took these things and sort of fed them into something new. And because there were so many of them, the thing that came out of the other end of the machine was felt like it was equally new and equally innovative and striking.
Something also that we alluded to before, but the fact that there was different scenes in different cities and whatever, but it was reminding me of sort of like a Beatles / Beach Boys rivalry, where one band would try to up the other band with their next release. And it was just like this constant thing like, oh yeah, I kind of like these guys, but we're going to do this now, and that was just a really nice kind of thread to see through the whole book. I mean, it was friendly competition in most cases, but it was definitely competition.
It absolutely was. Yeah. And right at the beginning, I thought it was quite funny that I was talking just previously about how these bands didn't really know that each other existed.
Yeah.
And there's a part in the book where Andy McCluskey from Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark talks about hearing the Normals' Warm Leatherette in Eric's nightclub in Liverpool for the first time. And he's just like, oh my God, it's like someone else is already doing what we want to do. This is the thing that got them to sort of start moving.
Yeah, and like how Annie Lennox and the Eurythmics, Dave and Annie were so upset when they had her Yaz come out because they were like, "Oh my God, we're working on that sound," and then boom, someone already did. It's just
It must have been incredibly frustrating for them because I think all these people were sort of using the same machines. So they came with the same set of sounds. And as an aside, I don't even know if it's in the book, but Phil Oakey from the Human League made the point that of all the new records that were coming out, everyone was just using the preset sounds that synthesizers already made. They weren't making their own sounds at all. They weren't actually pushing these machines to any sort of limits. They were just basically getting them out of the box and plugging them in and all using the same things. And I think you're right. They started listening to each other's records and saying, "Oh, it's like that. What's that drum machine? And how did they make that snare sound? Without actually using a snare." And they thought we have to use that, and then we have to get a newer thing that we can put on to make our record more modern and more cutting edge and more exciting than that one. It was, kind of extraordinary. And although it feels now like the rivalry was friendly, I wonder if it always was.
Right.
I get the impression that there is a lot of people being pushed, and they're pushing the machines to do new things, but they're also pushing sort of where they are. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I think too that they're pulling in aspects of modernism and cinema and just like household noises. Like suddenly, like what happens if we play a ceiling fan, and speed it up and slow it down? There's all this weird sort of innovation. It's almost like the 20s with jazz musicians just like messing around trying to figure out what they're doing. And I think that the ability of the synthesizer to give them this like flexibility is really a profound focal point of the 20th century in popular culture.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the other important thing about the synthesizer was that you didn't have to be a musician to play it. So there was none of that, having to go out and, buy your guitar and then sit in your bedroom and strumming it until your fingers bled, until the calluses developed, for years, and then having to do the sort of the pub circuit or whatever the equivalent would be for you guys, the tiny sort of horrible rock venues. These people, like I said before, they could just take this thing out of the box, they could plug it in, and they could start making noises immediately, and they didn't have to have any of that prerequisite. And I think that is probably the essence of how startling these new records were, because they didn't follow any of the rules. They didn't follow those musical structures. They didn't sort of, no one had paid their dues as musicians. They were just, I was going to say having fun, but I think a lot of them took it much more seriously than that. Like you were just saying, Rob, it's like, they were pulling in, from modernism and the Bauhaus and from cinema and from literature and all of these things. It was. I'm not sure that there will be another revolution like it.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that point really quickly. There's a quote in the book from Eno. He says, "I realized that there were certain areas of music you could enter without actually learning an instrument, which at my age, I certainly wasn't about to do." And I remember from that time, there was a real bias against synthesizers. And you had bands like Queen who would brag on the back of their album cover, no synthesizers were used in the making of this record. And certainly people that I knew and hung out with, and I'm gonna totally out myself, I'll be perfectly honest, I was one of them, said things like, if you had any actual musical talent, you'd be playing guitar or drums rather than having computers make music for you, that kind of thing. And, I've seen you mention the anecdote where the musicians union tried to ban synthesizers for fear that they might put proper musicians out of work. Where does this bias come from, and why was it so prevalent? And what do you think it was that got over that hump?
I think it came from progressive rock predominantly. And I think it came from the progressive rock musicians themselves, because I think they set themselves up as virtuosos. It's like Rick Wakeman, with his multiple keyboards, and his sparkling cape, spinning like a magician, it's like,
absolutely,
a mad scientist kind of thing. And I think they made it very, very clear that this was not something that mere mortals could do. And I think that was something that people liked at the time, because people wanted to admire that virtuosity. I think it was punk that sort of swept that admiration for musical talent away. So all of a sudden, these guys were sort of, post-punk, but they still had their Emerson, Lake and Palmer records. They still had their Yes records. It's like those things were still feeding in. And they were inspired by them in the fact that they'd seen them and heard them, and they'd watched these virtuoso performances. But they were sort of doing their own, filtered through punk rock with the addition of all these other things going on. And all of a sudden, they could do things that sounded like real things without, like I said, without the necessity to spend years, honing their craft.
There was an interesting quote about Martin Rushent, that basically he took the easiest way of getting things down, like an idea or something, that it did, rather than having someone play it like for 6 hours and not getting the part, he could just feed it into the machine and it would come out. And like that was his approach to making it, but also that he could turn out really good, amazing pop sounds and melodies from that machine.
Yes, Martin Rushton's actually a really interesting character in this story. And he in himself sort of reflects the whole narrative of the book, in that before he started working with Visage and the Human League, he was a punk rock producer. And before that, he was like an engineer for people like, I think, Elkie Brooks and very mainstream commercial artists. And then he sort of stumbled into punk rock, and he was the producer for the Stranglers and for the Buzzcocks. So he did those things, and then he was in this offer. He was offered a record deal, and he set his own label up called Genetic. And his office just happened to be literally upstairs from the Blitz Club in London. So, although he confessed at the time to being the least fashionable man alive, he had a big beard,
yes,
wore a jumper. This sort of revolution in fashion and style and music was happening literally downstairs from his office, and that just happened to be how he met these bands. So he was the first person to listen to, the Spandau Ballet stuff. He was one of the first people to listen to the Visage stuff. He was one of the first people to listen to some Human League stuff. So he was kind of well placed, and also he was agile enough to adapt his approach, but you can still see that sort of punk rock immediacy coming through. It's like he wasn't interested in the process; he just wanted to get to the final results that presumably he could hear in his head.
How did your experiences, working for MTV Europe and at a label, sort of influence, and then knowing a lot of the artists, and as well as spending all the time doing the research, how did you sort of keep your perspective in line, like on a straight line, for doing for the book? Because obviously some of the people personally, but then you have to write a book professionally. Sort of, how did you toe that line?
Yeah, I think it never, at no point did it feel like the book was like a professional endeavor. It always felt like a hobby thing. And it always felt like it was separate to the real world. Although I was aware that I do know some of the people that I was writing about, and it's possible that did change a little bit the things that I shared about them, and the things that were said about them. I don't think I particularly let it bother me, because actually the people that I do know who are the characters in this book, I think that I don't think there's anyone who would be offended for me reporting that in 1979 the NME was rude about them. So it felt like quite a compartmentalized process. It was always sort of on the back burner. It was always something that I was doing, not secretly, but I hadn't really discussed it with any of these people until I needed to. So I think you're aware that my day job, I work for the band Erasure. So Vince Clarke obviously is a huge character in this book, and it wasn't really until the book was finished that I spoke to him and said, by the way, it's like, I've done this.
Wow.
And, would you be interested in sort of, helping out in any way? And he immediately said that he would be absolutely happy to do anything. So I took that as that moment to ask him to write the introduction to it, which he agreed to do. And I sent him some pages. And to this day, I still don't know if he ever read them. But he wrote a great introduction for me.
That's fantastic.
And then John Fox was someone else, and the title of the book, which it's not a very familiar title to a lot of people. Listening to the Music the Machines Make is a line from a song, and the song's called Just for a Moment, and it's from the Ultravox album Systems of Romance. So it was the words were written by John Fox, and I was listening to that album in my car, and I was probably about halfway through the book process, but probably not even halfway. And the song came on, and I thought, "God, that's a fantastic line." And it's like, I wish that I could use that as a title for the book. And I contacted John, and he said, "Of course, just use it." He didn't even ask to read anything. It's like the sort of the trust that people showed me was extraordinary.
I think that access is actually one of the strengths of the book.
At the beginning of the book process, my intention was to talk to the artists much, much more. But I realized that kind of skewed the story that I was telling. And because I was telling it from the perspective of the way it was received at the time, the fact that I would be asking people to view these events again from a perspective of 40 years. It's like, do you remember, writing that B-side? It's like, were you in Studio A or Studio B? It's like, the chances of them actually remembering that would be fairly slim. And even if they sort of took a stab at it, I wasn't quite sure how reliable it would be. So although they were very supportive and were very willing, I didn't use them as much as I expected them to. And most of the people that I talked to, I didn't talk to in an interview situation particularly. Usually I just send them an email and I'll say, I'm writing about this record and, so-and-so said this and the reviews were a little bit lukewarm. Can you remember whether there was pressure from the record company or something like that? And it was kind of just to sort of fill some of the gaps that I couldn't fill on my own from the research materials. And it seems to have worked and people seem to have responded quite well to it. It's like quite a few of the people who are in the book have now had the book. And so far, so good.
One thing that actually speaking about that and how things were received, I was laughing so many times in the book when I read the actual reviews from the press. Now, I often find critics just hilarious anyway, but the British press is especially like over the top with their words and their like harshness, and then they're some are people are going crazy and like loving something, and the other people are hating it, but it makes me think that it almost like it's so subjective and it doesn't really matter. They're just writing words about something it might be so personal to a person, all these songs that they were trashing. I'm thinking like, I loved that song, when they were, and even like the bands themselves sometimes didn't like their songs. I think Japan was saying when they put I Second That Emotion out, they didn't like it. To me, that was one of my favorite songs when I was, 17 years old. I can remember listening to that in my bedroom, So that was a very interesting and funny kind of thread throughout the whole book.
A good example of that is Edward Pouncey in Sounds Magazine. In his review of the Eurythmics' Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, he called it a lifeless plod of a song that drones on like a flood warning siren. That is hilarious and brilliant. And wrong on all counts, but brilliantly stated.
And about the single Rio, one of my favorite was Record Mirror's Jim Reed. He wrote all the joie de vivre of an ingrowing toenail.
Yes.
Okay, alrighty then.
Well, I think that all those quotes sort of emphasize too that the music press really was caught off guard by this whole revolution and how to respond to it. Right.
As the public was too, I think.
Yeah. But I also think that, the fact that a lot of great music of this time came out of like working cities, particularly in the North, more out of habit. I think that really affected it too. But like just the complete way that the reception of this was received by critics speaks to it. And I think one of the great things that I liked about the book is that I feel a lot of this music that I loved growing up, or that I heard sort of circumspect by growing up, has been validated now 30, 40 years later as being really artistically innovative.
Yeah, like Duran Duran just got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. To me, that says a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a lot of the bands in this book are now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because Depeche Mode are and the Eurythmics are as well. So it really has become validated. It's like, and like you say, the press of the time, this 1978, especially at the beginning, were absolutely savage.
Yeah.
It's like they kind of had no good word to say about anyone. Some of the more extreme bands, Throbbing Gristle, for one, and Cabaret Voltaire, I think that their music was so uncompromising and so strange that the press didn't quite dare to slag it off like they did with the more poppy commercial sounding things.
I have to give you a big thank you for one thing in particular for this book. I have heard the name Throbbing Gristle before. I knew nothing about them. I had never heard them before, but reading this book, I dug them up and started listening to them. And
good,
unbelievable. Oh my gosh. So thank you for giving me the inspiration to finally look up this band and see what they're about. And it's amazing.
Yeah, they're yeah.
Yeah, that's an absolute pleasure. And it's kind of music to my ears in that in an ideal world, what I wanted people to do after reading this book, it's like I knew that some people who would be reading it, a lot of people who'd be reading it would know a lot of this stuff already. Mm-hmm. So it's like my twin aim was to include material that people didn't already know and hadn't encountered perhaps for 30 or 40 years. And the other side was hopefully people would try things that they hadn't tried before, especially the bands from the early part of the book, and they would find new things to like. So that's kind of, like I say, music to my ears that you actually went out and listened to Throbbing Gristle as a result of reading about them. That's brilliant. Thank you.
So, Richard, I'm wondering if you're going to do this thing that is very British with books when they come out, like when Simon Reynolds puts out some of his books and John Savage, when he puts out some of his books, they put out like a CD or a record that accompanies the book down the road. Are you going to do that, or are you going to put a playlist together, or, did you sort of have a musical blueprint for songs of where you wanted to go with the book and the narrative?
There isn't an album in progress. It hadn't even really occurred to me that would be a good idea until quite a long way into the process. Because like I say, it was like I was just sort of doing it in the background of everything else that I was engaged in. So it didn't ever really quite feel like a proper project until all of a sudden it was. And then it was kind of all too late. But there are actually some fantastic compilations already coming through.
Yeah.
Cherry Red Records over here are putting out some quite brilliant electronic music compilations in a sort of a year-by-year basis, which are well worth a listen. So I haven't done that, and there isn't really a plan. But there are, if you go to Spotify and search for Listening to the Music Machines Make, there are some playlists which accompany the sort of the various chapters in the book. So that's as far as it's got in those terms.
I was just thinking about the advent of MTV and basically how it was a second British invasion for us receiving this kind of music in America. And I think there was, you were saying up to a point in 1983 where there was like 30% of the sales of records in the US were from British acts. And I just wanted to sort of touch on that whole, genesis of MTV and how that brought those bands into our world over here. Because, I mean, a lot of that music was happening over there and it wasn't necessarily on the radar of people in America.
And a lot of that comes from a lot of American acts had no interest in doing music videos. They didn't understand them. They didn't want to spend the money on all the time on them.
Right.
And a lot of the younger British acts were from art school and they understood the marketing, the visual connection to the music. They understood it in a way that American artists didn't.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sort of touches on something that Rob was talking about earlier. It's like the bands that I write about are mostly British. They're not exclusively British, but because I use the British press as my sort of research, it tended to be them. But these bands, like you say, were often art school based. And like Rob mentioned, it's like they were bringing in all these strange influences to their music. So they were very savvy when it came to art and literature and popular culture. And they were not shy about bringing those things in. And they could, because, video was becoming a new medium, and they were the kind of bands that they were, forward-facing, modern, looking to the next thing, then it made perfect sense to them that video would be the place to go.
It was a perfect conflagration of everything happening.
Absolutely. And it was just like a perfect bit of timing, really. So bands, started to sort of have the opportunity to video themselves, and then they could take that further. They could, bring in more to more narrative, more plot, more effects, more art, and they could do all these things. And that, as you say, MTV started in the USA. And there was a dearth of videos. They didn't have the content.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, all these British bands were like, "Well, we've got a video." It's like, and I think the best example of these is Duran Duran.
Totally, 100%.
Who absolutely owned MTV at the beginning. It's like they were so completely in sync, with what MTV's aims were, and they were just pulling out these quite extraordinary videos. It's like they traveled to Sri Lanka quite early on, and I think they made 4 videos in 4 days. And you see them today. They come onto the TV, and they still look like high production. They weren't. It's like just out of shot. It was it was hot and horrible and kind of low budget.
Yeah, I couldn't believe when I read how low budget they were. I didn't really realize it. I didn't think that they would be. I thought they were expensive, but they
look expensive.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think this also sort of feeds into this whole new way of making music, because these bands were not doing the whole let's tour the tiny clubs, and build up a following from the beginning. They had to find a way of introducing themselves in another way. And because the American way, I think at that time, was still really to be doing those clubs, to be approaching their careers in quite an old school way in comparison to Britain. And I think also that's partly geographic, in that obviously Britain is much, much, much smaller. So you have to work less hard to sort of, to make an impact. Whereas, in America, it's obviously absolutely huge.
Yeah. And then MTV was really, the bands would be played so much on MTV that by the time they did get here, they already had their built-in audience. They were able to sell tickets to their shows because people knew who they were.
Yeah, and British bands that didn't do particularly well in Britain could become huge, huge American stars. A Flock of Seagulls, springs to mind for that, because they worked so hard in America, to probably to the detriment of their careers over here. But it's like, if you're going to be successful in one or the other, then financially it makes sense to be successful in America, where there's 100 times more people buying your records. So MTV was incredibly important, and particularly in taking this music and spreading it internationally. It was key. Yeah.
I want to jump back to a previous point for just a minute. We were talking about the affordability of synthesizers to the public. And that's what sort of launched this whole electronic revolution in pop music. But I want to go back a little farther than that, like 2 decades farther, because this same thing was happening with the sort of avant-garde classical composers in the 50s and the 60s. So you had Studio for Electronic Music was founded in Germany in 1951, and you have these composers sort of coming out of that scene. Stockhausen worked as an intern basically for that studio, and then started composing his own electronic pieces in the 60s and 70s. You had Varese, whose Poème Électronique came out in 1957. Xenakis, Diamorphoses came out in 1957, and he continued to compose electronic pieces throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And, I mentioned earlier how I had that sort of bias against the whole electronic revolution. But when I came to college, I was a music major, and I started to learn about these composers, and it really changed my sort of perspective on the whole electronic field. And I'm curious to know, what was the awareness of that scene with these kids? Because they're coming up on Bowie, and they're coming up on science fiction films. And, you even have the Beatles' Revolution #9, which is pushing pop outside of what the typical song constraint is, and it's a completely new thing to most people who are hearing it. So how did any of this stuff affect the way that these kids who are coming up and are buying the first synthesizers, how did it affect them?
I think it did to an extent, but
yeah,
maybe to a limited extent. I feel that although Stockhausen was, for example, to sort of pull from your list, was important, I think he was important on the generation that came after him. And it was that generation which was important to the people that I write about.
Yeah.
And it's like Rob made the point earlier that there was like a kind of a jazz sort of organic sort of jazz sort of type scene, springing up around this. And I think that's very, very true of Germany in particular. So in the sort of the post-war Germany, while Germany is sort of starting to rebuild itself and rebuild itself as a different Germany, with music, for example, which doesn't hark back to the old days, but instead looks forward to a bright new world. So I think, Stockhausen and the German experimenters sort of paved the way for people like Can and Neu, and the bands that are sort of now considered krautrock, to sort of use a slightly, pejorative word for it. But those bands were the bands that were directly influenced on the bands that I write about.
I also think that they also had a huge influence on like Einstürzende Neubauten and Psychic TV and a lot of those sort of like industrial bands that came along later.
Sure.
I mean, I think like Trent Reznor is much more Stockhausen than he is Vince Clarke, right?
Yes.
So
that makes sense.
I think as you get to industrial music, which is sort of the elephant in the room later, I think that's where a lot of that stuff really sort of seeped in, because people wanted to move on and hear something totally different. So,
yeah, it's interesting actually, because we were talking earlier about starting and finishing the book, and I wasn't quite sure where to start or where to finish. But I finished in 1983 basically because the last record I felt it was essential to write about was Blue Monday by New Order. Because that record signposted so many things after it. It was that whole Arthur Baker electro New York that went into house, and it went into techno, and then the sort of everything started to fragment at that point into subgenres, and those subgenres would have subgenres of their own, and it just got so incredibly complicated.
But I love how you did that. And I love that there was almost like that coda of like the late 80s to early 90s of how basically Kraftwerk and Gary Numan went to influence like electro funk, early hip hop, like Africa Bambaataa and Malcolm McLaren with Buffalo Gals, which kind of was the whole precursor to Frankie Knuckles and the Chicago and the Detroit sound, and then Mars. And I just want to hold up, because this is when I was starting to work at Island as an intern, and I was so fortunate enough to work Mars and Eric B. and Rakim and all these cool records that were really up my alley. So we had that 4th and Broadway imprint that carried a lot of that stuff. So that was all just really interesting, that like thread of influence through any, obviously until today too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that by 1983, it's like bands like you just mentioned, Rob, they were looking further afield for new influences, because it kind of felt by 1983 that everything was electronic. All the bands that sort of poo-pooed in 1979 were suddenly coming out with electronic music of their own. It's like it sort of ran through. Yes, 9012 is it?
That's right.
I can never remember the number, but yeah. So when Yes worked with Trevor Horn, it was almost like a circle had been closed.
Yes,
and those sort of people who were more interested in the harder edged things, I think they went back to Neu, and they went back to the krautrock sounds, and that became Nine Inch Nails and
Ministry and
Ministry and all these guys. Yeah.
I also think too that the sort of bookend between I Feel Love and Blue Monday is perfect for identifying the club culture of the time. But I also think, I was thinking like going into this, why the hell did he end it in 83? And that was my big thing going. It's like, okay, and I started to think about it. I'm like, okay, well, after 83, you get sort of like the rise of the duo. I mean, you get the Pet Shop Boys, you get way more, you get Erasure, you get a lot more. And by this point, you can't, at some point, you're going to go nuts trying to write a book beyond that. So and I think you did a really good job of sort of framing that, right? Because it really does get convoluted. And also by 84, Cabaret Voltaire is kind of a different band. And there's some interesting stuff going on, but there's also a really big dilution of it, right? Yeah. So I think that was a really good thing. And, I was really glad to see somebody write about, because there's so much that's written about Blue Monday. But I just wanted to see someone write about it from like a point of view that was just, hey, it's Blue Monday, right? Because it's, it's sort of like the sing of the late 20th century. It's just relentless, and it's incredible, and it's still relevant. And I thought that was a really good stopping point, especially since you set the table so hard with the Kraftwerk records and I Feel Love.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier about how it felt like I Feel Love was a punk record, and I think that Blue Monday is equally a punk record. It has that sort of attitude to it. And what amazed me actually doing the research about Blue Monday was how much the critics hated it at the time.
Oh, God, yes.
It absolutely destroyed it. And it's like it was funny to me because I was writing the journalists' names, and I was thinking, I wonder if these journalists will see this writing and look back and think, I wish that I'd said something different about Blue Monday.
Like, how wrong was I?
Over here, people didn't love it either. I went to a record store and I was buying imports, and somebody's like, "This is garbage, but you'll love it," and just gave it to me in my bag.
Nice.
So, like, thank you for giving me an original factory friggin' copy of Blue Monday.
That again goes to the thing. I was like, I remember dancing to that at Danceteria nonstop. Like, that was just, again, it's one person's opinion, a critic or something, but it's really what the public thinks.
That's right.
And you touched on the fact that you danced at Danceteria. And I think that something we haven't really touched on in this conversation is the importance of clubs.
That's where I heard all this stuff,
this
really.
Grassroots thing, and particularly in taking this thing to America. It's like it was the same kids who were watching MTV who were dancing in the clubs and spreading this word.
Yeah.
I was really lucky that in my formative years, I was able to go to a juice bar and hear all this stuff. And, we saw the videos and we heard it. But we were under 21, Steph.
So was I, but I was still going to them clubs.
But I mean, it was later when I was sneaking into those clubs when I started to look like, when I was 18, I could look like I was 21, right? But it's not easy to do that in Midwestern America.
Yeah,
it's not
true. It's easier in New York. Yeah.
Sneaking into a club is not, But like, it was like a tidal wave over the youth culture of my time. Like 83 to 87, when I was in high school, it was like, what is this, right? And suddenly all the kids with the angular haircuts that were like being hunted down by all the guys in, in like metal stud jackets, right? They were stopping, and it was all kind of like this whole new, like, wait a minute, we got to do a reset on what we're doing. So I think that this was more of a global movement, I think, than people initially thought it was. And I think a lot of these artists, as you look into going closer to 83, are beginning to realize that they're in the middle of something bigger than they are, right? And we haven't even talked about what this stuff did to Japan. I mean, when Blue Monday hit Japan and I Feel Love hit Japan, right? It completely changed the nature of how Japanese radio played pop music. And I mean, it's really fascinating to study sort of the permeation of this stuff around the world. I mean, Gary Numan, that very first Two Boy Army record was like hugely influential in Japan. And then later on, like places like Mexico City and stuff were having these like amazing pop-up electronic music scenes based on these British records Like, it's fascinating. It's completely interesting. So
yeah, it was a really interesting period of time to be writing about, because it was so fertile and so exciting. And that didn't even just consign itself to electronic music. There was so much other stuff going on at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's like, when you were dancing in Danceteria, or you're watching MTV, then you'd be seeing the ska bands that came out of Britain,
Totally.
the Beatles and the Beats and
all that.
And there was a big wave of that here too, of American ska. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's the new wave stuff that was Blondie and Elvis Costello and, all of these guys. And yes, so much happening sort of simultaneously. The Stray Cats, sort of going back to rock and roll, and all of these things were happening simultaneously. It must have been, it was incredibly exciting here, but over there as well. I'm sure it was, quite.
And then you've got at the same time, you've got Sparks going to England to work to take all this back to America later, right? Yeah. You've got Laurie Anderson who's doing her own thing and bringing the Stockhausen sort of classical element back to it, and really making it like planting a flag for this as an experimental musical form, right? So it is at the same time experimental, modern, and popular all at once, which I don't think you can say about a lot of.
No, that's absolutely true. It's also interesting that some of the more avant-garde American acts were accepted in Britain first, and because they became successful in Britain, they suddenly achieved that sort of cool cachet because they were sitting alongside, the British acts. So Laurie Anderson, I think, was number 2 over here with Oh Superman. It's a huge and it's like there is the sort of the quirkiness of those records appealed here, fed into what the British acts were doing, and sort of reflected, bounced back, to America, and America sort of, I think, took a second look at some of their own groups, that was important.
Like Devo never probably would have gotten anywhere in America without Bowie, really sort of carrying the flag for them.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that, because I remember the first time, like it was yesterday, I remember the first time I ever saw Devo, and that was them appearing on Saturday Night Live. It was like season 2 or 3, long time ago. And I thought, what the absolute hell is this nonsense? And, I've kind of come around to them. And in Atlanta, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. We're very fortunate to have a very good Devo tribute band. So, I've seen them and I love them. So it's so interesting, the initial reaction to some of these things. It takes a little time to catch up.
It does take you off guard. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's like it sort of felt like, I was talking earlier about how the British bands weren't really aware of each other's presence. It felt like that was kind of happening in America as well, and it's like that whole Akron. Do I pronounce it Akron or Akron? Akron.
Akron. Yeah.
Akron.
So it's like all of a sudden the British press, decamped to Ohio because of Pere Ubu and because of Devo. And they were sort of desperate to find a new thing, because all of a sudden, although they'd been caught on the back foot when the first electronic music came through, they kind of were starting to realize that this was something that they couldn't ignore, they couldn't necessarily dismiss entirely, and they wanted something that they could own, I think, whereas the spirit of punk running through some of the other early records meant that they happened despite the press rather than because of the press. So the press was anxious to find their own, and they looked to America to find it. And Devo was absolutely huge over here, just for a short time, but they were the coolest, most interesting, most unusual. It's like they released almost nothing, and they were getting front covers of the major music press, because all of a sudden it's like something is happening here, and we're not quite sure what it is, but we better tell you about it, because you'll find out about it, and then we'll look bad.
Can you talk about? I am just, both as a Doctor Who fan and also a person that loves this music, I am completely mesmerized by, the work of Delia Derbyshire in bringing this music to the world, and the fact that it's a woman who's kind of unheralded and unchampioned, and the last 2 decades have really seen her sort of grow. But can you kind of talk about that sort of era of electronic music and what that means to the history of it?
I think Delia Derbyshire. Well, Doctor, it's difficult to know where to start. I think the interesting thing about being in Britain at that time, in the sort of this would have been the 60s, but in the 60s and the 70s, is that we had 3 TV channels. Yeah. So that's all we had. It's like, so anything that was on television immediately got an absolutely massive audience. And that was the secret of Top of the Pops. You know, every Thursday night, it's like you would be guaranteed 10 million people would be watching it. You know, it was, you know, incredible. And the fact that the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was responsible for some of the most striking sounds and themes from some of the most important science fiction type shows was absolutely essential. And because as soon as Doctor Who was on, there was immediately this multi-million audience for it. And it tapped into a spirit of future, which I think is also another important thread that runs through certainly the beginning of the book, is that this generation of people are the people who experienced the moon landing, and then they experienced computers, and, you know, it's like all this technology was moving so fast, and it felt like that future that we were promised with jetpacks and flying cars and, you know, a pill instead of a meal was absolutely attainable. And because of this sort of spirit of future, science fiction was absolutely huge over here. So, you know, Doctor Who was massive. And because Delia Derbyshire had provided those sounds, not just the sounds for the theme, but the sounds that sort of, you know, were in the background. Her influence on this scene cannot be underestimated, because I'm pretty sure that anyone of the generation of people that I write about, if you ask them how important the Doctor Who theme was to them, they would all say yes. You know, and it's like, you know, from Depeche Mode to Orbital, you know, would say that this was an incredibly important thing. And it's like, I think that in the same way as we were talking about the impact of I Feel Love and the impact of New Blue Monday, the Doctor Who theme was so strange and so groundbreaking and so other, that it was something for people to latch onto. And the people who seem to have latched onto it the most was this impressionable generation of people who would turn in to the generation who wrote these amazing electronic records.
Yeah.
Richard, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you about this. The book, the whole scene, it is such an exciting time in pop music history.
It was an absolute pleasure. I've really, really enjoyed the chat. It's like it feels like it could go on for many hours more.
Yeah, good. Really, the book has so many things that you just want to delve into. It's really highly recommended. Please get that book, everybody.
Yes, absolutely.
And Richard, the highest compliment, because these two are well aware of my vast and great dislike for Spandau Ballet, right? You have made me want to re-examine Spandau Ballet.
Please do it.
Yeah, re-examine the early Spandau Ballet records, because they're very different from that that yacht rock true, and
that's kind of what I need to be reminded of, right?
They're so funky and awesome in the beginning.
You also made me want to go back and re-listen to my Japan records, which I haven't done in forever as well.
That's what I was listening to this week.
Yeah, I was listening to a lot of Japan records this week, and just and you know, as somebody that does a radio show every week, when you rediscover something that's been dormant for a while, it leads you down rabbit holes that are just great. There's 5 hours of my day. So thank you for, in the middle of 30,000 things I have going on, making me go down rabbit holes. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. Right?
I'm taking it in the nicest way possible. You're very, very welcome.
Well, once again, thank you so much. And mention the book one last time.
Okay, so remember, listening to the Music the Machines Make, Inventing Electronic Pop 1978 to 1983, is published by Omnibus Press. It's available now. It is the histories of the various pioneers who invented electronic pop.
And you have a website too, right?
Oh, I do have a website too.
Yeah, talk about that.
So the website is called inventingelectronicpop.com. Facebook is electronic pop, and Instagram is @electronic pop also.
Fantastic. Thank you so much once again. We have greatly enjoyed our time with you.
Pleasure. Really nice to meet you all.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
All right, so stick around. We're going to take a quick break, 30 seconds, and then we're going to be right back with our picks of the week. So stay tuned.
Attention, people of Earth! Looking for a way to kill half an hour every week?
Try the Flopcast. It's a silly podcast about cartoons, music, comics, movies, obscure pop culture from the 70s and 80s, and chickens.
Join us! Bring coffee!
We're on the ESO network.
And we're at flopcast.net.
Okay, we're back. What did y'all think of the Richard Evans interview?
Wow.
Holy
he
cow.
Was
He was
first of
so
all, he was
nice.
so interesting. Yeah, so nice, so interesting, and had so much great things to say. And
yeah.
His book is just, I really, really was, it took me back into that time of my life when I was,
absolutely.
A teenager, and I really felt like I was reliving those years.
Yeah. It led me to listen to stuff I'd never heard before, like the very first 2 or 3 Human League singles I'd never heard. I only knew them from radio and MTV, so I only knew Don't You Want Me, and after that point I'd never heard those early ones, and they're so different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
He made me listen to stuff I never heard either, and I hear a lot, but he also made me sort of feel validated for like just the pummeling I took for liking this stuff in the 80s. So
yeah. We're going to get to our picks of the week, but first we have some other business to take care of. Rob, take it away.
So as is happening way too frequently than Steph Ryer, you probably like, we keep losing these giants of music, of most recently like our childhoods, right? So we lost Tom Verlaine on January 28th of television. And we talk a lot on this podcast about 1977 and how incredible it was. And one of the most significant reasons why 1977 was such an amazing year, and while both post-punk and indie music in the United States is the way it is because of television and their album Marquee Moon. I know it's sort of like this, one of the records that you get handed to when you say, I want to be a cool kid. It's kind of one of the records now that they get handed, and tons of stuff have been written about it. And Verlaine was the guitarist and vocalist of the band. But it's one of those rare cases when you listen to Marquee Moon that the vocalist and the guitarist, who are the same person, are both equally great, because sometimes they do one better than the other. But he was a virtuoso of the guitar. His vibrato style of playing was really great at singing. And that band is, they only put out 2 albums. They did a reunion album later. They were just an incredibly great band, and way more innovative after they broke up than they were when they were around, which is really sad. But Verlaine made also, I think, 10 solo records that are all incredibly interesting and fascinating. And he played on Penthouse by Luna and Gung Ho by his former girlfriend, Patti Smith. So again, this is somebody who left a pretty big footsteps in American indie music and post-punk and punk and that whole New York scene as well. I mean, it's kind of staggering. And, it's kind of like the bookend of Terry Hall when he passed away in December. We're losing these like people that created movements and sound and left giant footprints in music. And it's very sad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do our picks of the week. So, Steph, why don't you kick it off?
I have only been listening to I swear Richard's book made me go down rabbit holes, just like Rob said. I was going down my Japan rabbit hole because I haven't listened to them in so long, and just realizing how much I love them and David Sylvian's solo stuff. And so listening to a lot of Japan, but I would shout out especially the song European Sun, which I absolutely love. I'm still obsessed with Alanis Morissette's song called Rest that I mentioned last week. I really have listened to it like maybe 50 times. I can't stop.
Wow.
Yeah. But so yeah, it's really just, I don't really have anything new. It's mostly like stuff, my Duran Duran records that I've been pulling out, and like Rob said, Spandau Ballet, but I have. Sorry, Rob.
It's fine.
But yeah, Rob, what about you?
So they announced this week the Cruel World Music Festival lineup, which is a festival in LA. It's kind of like the counterbalance of all the hipster bands of the world now, but like Echo and the Bunnymen, the first Susie concert in like 30 years in America.
Oh my gosh.
Bunch of ABC, lots of bands are playing it, right? Love and Rockets are playing it. And I kind of knew when they canceled the Bauhaus tour, I kind of had a feeling we were going to get a Love and Rockets tour this year, and I think we're going to get a full on. I think we're going to get a new record too, but what do I know? But that made me dig out Love and Rockets a little bit, who I've always been a big fan for, because I remember at one point Stephanie told me when I was in her office, "Okay, I get it, you like Love and Rockets." But that first record, the Seventh Dream of Teenage Heaven, I've been playing that a lot just because I like the songs on it. And actually, Steph, one of the reasons why this happened was your husband.
Oh.
Because we were talking about producers and production, and the production on that thing was really amazing, but it also sort of set this stage for how all these other Beggars Banquet artists and sort of quasi-goth artists would handle production in a studio. So I've been listening to that a lot, the Seventh Dream of Teenage Heaven, and I love it. And then we had both Australia Day and Robbie Burns Day this week. And Australia Day made me go back and listen to a lot of those old records from the Chills and the Clean and Straight Jacket Fits, a lot of that Flying Nun stuff. But Robbie Burns Day made me do the most happy thing I love doing, and that is going back and digging out my Aztec camera records. Right?
Ooh, yay.
And Roddy Frame had a birthday this week as well. And that first record by the Highland Hard Rain is probably one of the records of probably one of my 5 records, right?
I saw that tour. Did you see that tour?
I have never actually seen them.
Okay.
But that record is just pretty astounding and stellar all the way through, and it's fantastic. And then also by reading Richard's book, I went and revisited Low, which is one of the Bowie records I like anyway. But I revisited Low this week by David Bowie, and I listened to it in different way. I did something I never have done. I haven't done in about 10 years with Low. I listened to it with headphones on. And it's a whole different record. It's a whole different experience. But I also listened for a lot of the stuff on that instrumental side that I wasn't looking for. Like I'm looking for like how they did note changes, and just I was sort of listening for a more technical aspect than I would as somebody who loves Bowie. And that thing's fantastic. I don't understand how people can't like it. So yeah. And again, after I listened to David Bowie's Low, I couldn't really find anything new to listen to that I wanted to hear after that. So that's my week.
All
What
right.
about you, Alan?
Well, I've got a couple of things, and the first 2 are ones that I wanted to get to a couple of weeks ago and kind of forgot to put on my list. I listened to on Sirius XM. I listened to Alt Nation an awful lot, just so I can hear a lot of the new things that are happening. And there's a couple of things that have really grabbed hold of me the last few weeks. And interestingly, they don't sound like anything else on Alt Nation because they're both pretty much acoustic guitar based. And the first one is by a band that I've been kind of attuned to for the past few years, and I've really liked what I've heard. They're called Young the Giant, and the song is called The Walk Home, and it's this sort of mid-tempo acoustic-y kind of thing, and it's so good. And the second one is it's by a group called Talk, and I don't really know anything about them. This isn't their first release, but it's the first one that I've ever heard. It's called Runaway to Mars, and it's this very slow acoustic guitar piece that even has like an a cappella break after the bridge going into the last chorus. It's so gorgeous. It is just amazing. And so I highly recommend anybody to go check out those two tracks. And the third thing is, and I kind of just stumbled upon this past week, I didn't even realize that it was coming out, is a new single by Jethro Tull.
No.
I don't even know how to pronounce the title of the song, but it's a phenomenal song. I absolutely love it. They have a new album coming out on April 21st called Rock Flute, spelled with weird characters and stuff. And this first single came out last week, and it's excellent. I absolutely love it. I cannot wait to hear what the album is going to be like.
Wow.
Okay, so that's us for this week. Before we wrap it up, tell people where they can find more of you. Stephanie, where can people find more of you?
People can find me on Bandcamp under my name. I have a website called therearebirds.com. You can find me on Facebook at Stephanie Seymour Music and on Instagram at there_are_birds. And of course, on all the streaming platforms everywhere.
All right, Rob, hit it.
So you can find me on by my name on the Facebook and the Twitter and Post. Yeah, I know. And also you can find me on the Weekend Justice podcast with needcoffee.com and on the radio every week from Wednesday nights from 7 to 9 on KDHX in St. Louis, streaming at kdhx.org. If you are busy that night, or if you just want to listen to it during the day, that's not a Wednesday, all of the shows on KDHX are archived for 2 weeks, so you can listen there.
Sweet.
Alan?
Ooh, thank you for asking. You can find Cosmic Press at kozmicpress.com. And that's got a big old list of my books and the books that I've published from other authors and the list of my podcasts that I do. And we have our other co-host, Anthony Williams, who is not with us this week. And you can find his podcast, Watchers in the Fourth Dimension. They are currently on hiatus, but they have 4.5 years worth of episodes to listen to. If you're a Doctor Who fan, I highly recommend it. Go listen to that show. It's fantastic. All right, so we'll be back next week. Until then, take care. Have a great week. Keep rocking on, and we will see you soon.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.